Jonathan hurled his father's cherished riding gear into the dumpster, severing the final link to a past he'd spent 20 years escaping. When his father's ancient horse frantically pawed at the discarded black bag, something deep inside the billionaire's fortified heart began to crack. Jonathan Maxwell stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, overlooking the sprawling estate that stretched across 20 acres of prime Connecticut countryside. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across his manicured lawns, illuminating the Olympic-sized swimming pool and the tennis court where he occasionally entertained business associates. At 45, Jonathan had everything money could buy: the mansion, the collection of luxury cars, the vacation homes in Aspen and the Hamptons, and Maxwell Investments, the firm he'd built from nothing into a Wall Street powerhouse. He sipped his 18-year-old scotch, savoring the burning sensation as it slid down his throat. The quarterly reports lay open on his mahogany desk, showing yet another record-breaking period. The numbers should have pleased him, but lately, nothing seemed to fill the hollow sensation that had taken residence in his chest. "Mr. Maxwell," his assistant's voice came through the intercom, interrupting his thoughts. "The attorney called again about your father's remaining belongings. He says if you don't make decisions soon, they'll have to proceed with standard disposal protocols." Jonathan pressed the button with an irritated sigh. "Tell him I'll handle it this weekend and reschedule my dinner with the Hansons. I'm not in the mood for small talk tonight." "Yes, sir," she replied, her voice revealing nothing of what she thought about his third cancelled social engagement this month. 3 months had passed since his father, Robert Maxwell, had died at 73. The old man had lived out his final years in the small farmhouse where Jonathan had grown up, stubbornly refusing his son's offers to move him to a more comfortable living situation. "I was born on this land, Johnny," he'd said, using the childhood nickname Jonathan now despised, "and I'll die on it too." Jonathan drained his glass and set it down with more force than necessary. His father's death should have been a simple matter to handle. The farmhouse and its surrounding 10 acres had already been sold to a developer, but the personal effects, the remnants of a simple life Jonathan had worked so hard to escape, remained in boxes in the guest house at the edge of his property. "Damn it," he muttered, knowing he couldn't put it off any longer. The guest house was a modern structure, all glass and steel, incongruous with the colonial architecture of the main residence. Jonathan had specifically designed it that way, a statement about moving forward, not looking back. He punched in the security code and pushed open the door, hit immediately by the musty smell of cardboard and old fabric. 7 boxes sat in the center of the otherwise empty main room, labeled in his assistant's neat handwriting, "R. Maxwell, personal items." Jonathan opened the first box with reluctance, as if expecting something to jump out at him. Inside were photo albums, their leather covers cracked with age. He flipped one open to find images of himself as a child, sitting atop a chestnut-colored horse, his father standing proudly beside him. Jonathan snapped the album shut, unwilling to confront the memories. The next box contained his father's clothes, flannel shirts worn thin at the elbows, jeans faded from years of honest work, the battered cowboy hat he'd worn every day of his life. Jonathan had offered to buy him new clothes countless times, but Robert had always refused. "These suit me just fine," he'd say. "Not everyone needs Italian suits and shiny shoes to feel like somebody." The third box made Jonathan freeze. Horse riding equipment, the worn leather saddle his father had taught him to care for meticulously, the bridle with the tarnished brass fittings, the curry combs and brushes they'd used together every Sunday morning to groom Chestnut, his childhood horse. And speaking of Chestnut, the old horse was another problem altogether. Now approaching 30 years old, the animal had been willed to Jonathan, another unwanted responsibility from his father's life. He'd allowed the horse to stay in the small stable at the far end of his property, paying the groundskeeper extra to tend to it, but he hadn't visited the animal once since it arrived. Jonathan grabbed a large black garbage bag from his pocket and began stuffing the riding equipment inside. The saddle, the bridle, the brushes, all of it went in with quick, angry movements. He didn't need these reminders of a life he'd left behind, of the disappointment in his father's eyes when he'd announced he was selling the family farm to fund his first investment venture. With the bag cinched tight, Jonathan marched across his property toward the dumpsters near the service entrance. The late afternoon had faded into early evening, the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. As he approached the rusty metal container, movement caught his eye. Chestnut, the old horse, had wandered from his stable to the small paddock that adjoined this part of the property. The animal stood at the fence line, watching Jonathan with what seemed like intelligent curiosity. "What are you looking at?" Jonathan muttered, tossing the black bag into the dumpster with a heavy thud. Just getting rid of some junk," but as the bag hit the bottom of the metal container, something strange happened. Chestnut's ears perked up, and the horse moved closer to the fence, nostrils flaring as he caught a familiar scent. A soft whinny escaped the animal, his eyes fixed not on Jonathan, but on the black bag now lying among the other discarded items. Jonathan stood frozen, watching as Chestnut pressed his muzzle against the fence, straining toward the dumpster. The horse's reaction was unmistakable: recognition. For a moment, the businessman felt an unexpected twinge in his chest, a feeling he quickly tried to suppress. "It's just garbage," he said aloud, as if the horse could understand him. "Old stuff nobody needs anymore." But Chestnut continued to stare, pawing at the ground with one hoof. The horse's coat wasn't as glossy as Jonathan remembered from his childhood, and grey hairs now peppered the animal's face. 30 was ancient for a horse, the equivalent of a human centenarian. By all rights, Chestnut should have been put down years ago, but Robert Maxwell had stubbornly refused. He's earned the right to live out his days in peace. His father had insisted during one of their last conversations. "Promise me you'll look after him, Johnny," Jonathan had agreed, if only to end the discussion. Another obligation, another tie to a past he'd spent decades trying to escape. As he turned to walk away, Chestnut let out a loud, insistent whinny that stopped Jonathan in his tracks. The sound transported him instantly to his childhood. Summer mornings in the stable, his small hands learning to saddle the young horse under his father's patient guidance. "You and Chestnut, you've got a special connection," Robert had told his 10-year-old son. "That's rare, Johnny. Something to be treasured." Jonathan shook his head, dispelling the memory. "I don't have time for this," he muttered, starting back toward the main house, but he'd only taken a few steps when he heard a commotion behind him. Turning, he saw that Chestnut had somehow worked the simple latch on the paddock gate with his teeth, a trick the horse had learned decades ago, and was now standing at the edge of the dumpster, stretching his neck to reach the black bag. "Hey!" Jonathan shouted, rushing back. "Get away from there!" But the damage was already done. Chestnut had managed to snag the bag with his teeth, pulling it partially out of the dumpster. The contents had spilled onto the ground, the bridle, a brush, and the corner of the old saddle now visible. Jonathan reached for the items, intending to throw them back into the trash, when Chestnut gently nudged his arm with his muzzle. The touch was warm, familiar in a way that made Jonathan's throat tighten unexpectedly. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice sounding strange even to his own ears. Chestnut snorted softly, lowering his head to nuzzle the worn leather of the saddle. The simple gesture held such obvious affection that Jonathan found himself reaching out automatically, his hand hovering just inches from the horse's neck before he caught himself. "Mr. Maxwell?" Jonathan turned to see Martin, his groundskeeper, approaching with a concerned expression. "Is everything all right, sir?" "I was just coming to bring Chestnut in for the night when I saw he'd gotten out." "Everything's fine," Jonathan replied stiffly, straightening his Italian silk tie. "The horse got into some trash, that's all." Martin glanced at the riding equipment scattered on the ground, recognition dawning in his eyes. "That was your father's tack, wasn't it? He mentioned it when we moved Chestnut here. Said it was the best saddle he ever owned." Jonathan felt a flash of irritation. "It's old and worn out, not worth keeping." "With respect, sir," Martin said cautiously. "Good leather like this. It's built to last generations if you care for it properly. Your father kept this in excellent condition." "I don't ride," Jonathan snapped. "I haven't been on a horse in 25 years." Martin nodded, seemingly unperturbed by his employer's tone. "Of course, sir. Would you like me to dispose of these items properly then?" Before Jonathan could answer, his cell phone rang. He checked the screen. It was Thomas Chen, his chief financial officer. "I have to take this," he said, already turning away. "Oh, do whatever you want with that stuff." As he walked toward the house, phone pressed to his ear discussing potential acquisitions and market forecasts. Jonathan couldn't help glancing back over his shoulder. Martin was carefully gathering the riding equipment while Chestnut watched with attentive eyes. Something about the scene made Jonathan stumble over his words mid-sentence. "And I'm sorry, Thomas, could you repeat that?" he asked, forcing his attention back to the call. Later that night, Jonathan sat in his home office, a glass of scotch in hand, as he reviewed documents on his laptop. But he was finding it difficult to concentrate. His mind kept drifting back to the expression in Chestnut's eyes when the horse had recognized the old riding gear. On impulse, he opened his browser and typed "average lifespan horses" into the search bar. The results confirmed what he already knew. At 30, Chestnut was living on borrowed time. Most horses didn't make it past 25 or 26. "He's a fighter," Robert had said proudly during Jonathan's last visit to the farm, 6 months before his death. "Like you used to be." The implied criticism had stung, as his father had intended it to. Another reason Jonathan had kept his visits brief and infrequent. He closed his laptop with more force than necessary and walked to the window. From here, he could just make out the small stable at the edge of his property, a single light burning above the door. Martin was thorough in his duties, ensuring the old horse was comfortable for the night. Jonathan's reflection stared back at him from the darkened glass. Designer suit, expertly cut hair, the trappings of success. But for a moment, superimposed over his reflection, he thought he saw a younger version of himself. A boy with untamed hair and a wide smile, sitting proudly atop Chestnut while his father looked on with approval. The image disturbed him more than he cared to admit. Sleep eluded Jonathan that night. He tossed and turned in his king-sized bed, Egyptian cotton sheets tangling around him as fragments of memories invaded his consciousness. The more he tried to push them away, the more insistent they became. At 3 in the morning, he finally gave up, pulling on a cashmere robe and making his way downstairs to his study. The house was silent, except for the ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the hallway, a timepiece that had once stood in his father's modest living room, one of the few items Jonathan had brought directly into his home. He poured himself a drink and sank into the leather chair behind his desk. Without conscious intention, he found himself opening the bottom drawer, reaching for a small lockbox he hadn't touched in years. The key was hidden in a hollowed-out book on the shelf, Thoreau's Walden, his father's favorite, another unwanted inheritance. Inside the box was a collection of items Jonathan had kept, despite his best efforts to sever ties with his past. His mother's wedding ring, a blue ribbon from his first horse show with Chestnut, and a photograph he now removed with reluctant fingers. The picture showed 13-year-old Jonathan sitting on the porch of the farmhouse, arm in arm with his father. It was taken the summer before his mother died, before everything changed. They were both smiling, the resemblance between them unmistakable, the same determined jaw, the same crinkle around the eyes when they laughed. "Why couldn't you just be proud of what I built?" Jonathan whispered to the image of his father. Why was it never enough? The last major argument they'd had was 5 years ago, when Jonathan had announced his intention to expand Maxwell Investments into emerging markets in Southeast Asia, a move that would require him to restructure several failing local businesses. "So you'll put 300 people out of work to make yourself richer?" Robert had asked, disappointment evident in his voice. "I'll make 15,000 new jobs in the process," Jonathan had countered. "That's progress." Progress, his father had repeated, the word sounding like an accusation. "You know, Johnny, there was a time when you measured success by more than just dollar signs." Jonathan had walked out, and they hadn't spoken for 6 months after that. When they finally did resume contact, they had silently agreed to keep their conversation superficial, avoiding any mention of Jonathan's business dealings or his father's increasingly anachronistic worldview. Now, staring at the photograph, Jonathan couldn't help wondering if they'd both been too stubborn, too unwilling to see the other's perspective. The sound of his security system beeping pulled him from his thoughts. Someone had opened an exterior door. Jonathan glanced at his watch. 4:15 a.m. None of his staff should be arriving for hours. Moving quickly to the security panel on the wall, he pulled up the camera feeds. The monitor showed Martin walking hurriedly toward the stable, flashlight in hand. Something was wrong. Without stopping to change, Jonathan slipped his feet into the loafers by the door and headed outside. The night air was cool against his face as he crossed the lawn toward the stable. As he drew closer, he could hear Martin's voice, low and soothing. "Easy now, old boy. Easy. That's it." Jonathan pushed open the stable door to find Martin kneeling beside Chestnut, who was lying on his side in the straw, breathing heavily. The horse's eyes were wide with panic, his flanks heaving with each labored breath. "What's happening?" Jonathan demanded, a strange fear gripping him at the sight of the distressed animal. Martin looked up, surprised to see his employer. "Colic, I think, sir. I have an alarm set on my phone that alerts me if Chestnut's heart rate goes above a certain level. Came as soon as it went off." "Is it serious?" Jonathan asked, moving closer despite himself. Can be fatal in horses, especially ones Chestnut's age," Martin replied grimly, running a hand along the horse's neck. "I've called the vet, but she's 40 minutes out." Chestnut let out a low, pained sound that seemed to reverberate through Jonathan's chest. Without thinking, he knelt down in the straw beside the animal, his expensive robe gathering dust and debris. "What can I do?" he asked, surprising both Martin and himself with the question. Martin hesitated only briefly. "Keep him calm, talk to him, horses respond to familiar voices." "He doesn't know my voice," Jonathan said. "Not anymore." Martin gave him a look that seemed to see right through him. "He knows you, Mr. Maxwell. Horses never forget." Feeling awkward and out of place, Jonathan nevertheless placed a tentative hand on Chestnut's neck. The horse's skin was hot and damp with sweat. "Hey there," he said, his voice sounding stiff and formal even to his own ears. "You're going to be fine. The vet is coming." Chestnut continued to breathe raggedly, showing no response to Jonathan's words. Martin moved to the horse's other side, gently massaging his belly in slow, circular motions. "Sometimes it helps to walk them," he suggested. But he's too weak to stand right now." Jonathan sat back on his heels, feeling helpless in a way he hadn't experienced in decades. In the boardroom, in business negotiations, he was always in control. Here, watching this animal suffer, he had no leverage, no strategy to deploy. Almost without conscious thought, words began to flow from him, not the stilted reassurances of moments ago, but something more genuine. "And do you remember that summer storm, Chestnut? The one that blew the roof off Old Man Wilson's barn?" His voice softened, taking on the cadence of storytelling. "You and I were out riding when it hit. Dad was furious when we got back soaked to the skin, but then he just laughed and said at least we had sense enough to come in out of the rain eventually." As he spoke, Jonathan noticed Chestnut's breathing begin to slow slightly, the panic in the horse's eyes receding just a fraction. "That's it," Martin encouraged quietly. "And to keep talking." So Jonathan did, pulling memories from places he'd kept locked away for years. Trail rides through autumn woods, early morning gallops across dew-covered fields, the simple pleasure of grooming Chestnut's coat until it gleamed in the sunlight. By the time the veterinarian arrived, Chestnut's breathing had stabilized somewhat, though the horse still couldn't stand. Jonathan found himself reluctant to move away as Dr. Mitchell examined the animal, administering medication through an IV line. "It's a good thing you caught it early," she told them after completing her examination. "Another hour, and we might have been having a different conversation." "Will he recover?" Jonathan asked, surprised by how much the answer suddenly mattered to him. Dr. Mitchell's expression was guarded. "Horses his age. Recovery is never certain. The next 24 hours will be critical. Someone should stay with him." "I'll stay," Martin offered immediately. "No," Jonathan said, the word emerging before he'd fully formed the thought. "I'll do it." Martin's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Sir, you don't have to." "I know I don't have to," Jonathan interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. "I'll stay." Dr. Mitchell handed him a small bottle of medication. "Give him 5 milliliters of this every 4 hours. Call me immediately if his breathing becomes labored again or if he shows signs of increased distress." After showing Jonathan how to administer the medicine and what warning signs to watch for, the veterinarian packed up her equipment. "I'll be back to check on him in the morning. Try to get him to drink a little water if you can." As Dr. Mitchell and Martin prepared to leave, the groundskeeper hesitated at the stable door. "There's a cot in the tack room," he said, "and some coffee in the thermos on the shelf. Call me if anything changes, day or night." Jonathan nodded, already settling himself on a bale of hay near Chestnut's head. When the door closed behind them, he was left alone with the horse and the sound of the animal's still labored breathing. "Well, just you and me now," he said quietly, reaching out to stroke Chestnut's neck. The horse's coat was rough beneath his fingers, nothing like the sleek, well-groomed animal of his memories. How long had it been since anyone had properly brushed him? The barn was silent, except for the occasional rustle of straw as Chestnut shifted position slightly. Jonathan checked his watch, 5:30 a.m. Dawn would be breaking soon. He should have been preparing for his 7 a.m. conference call with investors in London. He pulled out his phone to email his assistant, only to discover he had no signal in the stable. The isolation was strange. He couldn't remember the last time he'd been truly unreachable. Setting the phone aside, Jonathan leaned back against the wooden wall and continued to stroke Chestnut's neck in rhythmic motions. The repetitive action was oddly soothing. "Dad used to say you were the smartest horse in 3 counties, he found himself saying. "Remember how you'd unlatch your own stall? Drove him crazy until he put in that special bolt you couldn't figure out." Chestnut's ear twitched at the sound of his voice, and Jonathan took it as encouragement to continue. "He never sold you, you know, even when things got tight after Mom died." The bank wanted the farm, but he managed to keep 10 acres and the house. And you, Jonathan's throat tightened unexpectedly. He said some things weren't for sale at any price. The memory of those difficult years after his mother's death from cancer surfaced with surprising clarity. Jonathan had been 14, angry at the world, watching his father struggle to keep the farm going with mounting debts and declining health. "I thought he was a fool," Jonathan admitted, the words feeling like a betrayal even now. "I couldn't understand why he wouldn't just sell everything and start over somewhere else, somewhere easier." Chestnut shifted, lifting his head slightly to rest it against Jonathan's leg. The simple gesture of trust made something twist painfully in Jonathan's chest. "I was so determined to be different, to be smarter, to never end up in his position." He gave a humorless laugh. "I succeeded, I guess. No one would ever mistake me for Robert Maxwell now." As the first grey light of dawn filtered through the stable windows, Jonathan found himself drifting between wakefulness and uneasy sleep. In that half-conscious state, memories flowed more freely, his father teaching him to ride, to mend fences, to respect the land that supported them. Simple lessons that Jonathan had dismissed as irrelevant in the world he was determined to conquer. The sound of the stable door opening startled him fully awake. Jonathan blinked against the now bright morning light to see an elderly woman entering, carrying a wicker basket. "Well," she said, taking in the scene before her, "when Martin called and told me Jonathan Maxwell was spending the night in a horse stable, I had to see it for myself." It took Jonathan a moment to place her. "Mrs. Winters." "It's still Mrs. Winters, yes," she replied with a hint of amusement. "Though these days most people just call me Nancy." Nancy Winters had been their closest neighbor when Jonathan was growing up, her farm adjoining theirs to the east. She'd been a frequent visitor to their home, especially after his mother died, bringing casseroles and offering practical help that his father had been too proud to ask for, but too wise to refuse. "Martin mentioned you might need some breakfast," she said, setting the basket down. "And I brought something else I thought might help." From the basket, she produced a familiar curry comb and brush set, not his father's, but similar. "Proper grooming soothes them," she explained, seeing his confusion. "Helps with circulation too." "I haven't groomed a horse in 25 years, Jonathan said, feeling strangely defensive. Nancy shrugged, unimpressed by his protest. "It's like riding a bicycle. Your hands remember even if your mind thinks it's forgotten." She handed him the brush. "Besides, looks to me like Chestnut could use some attention from an old friend." Jonathan accepted the brush reluctantly, its wooden handle smooth against his palm. "We're hardly friends anymore," he muttered. Nancy's gaze was shrewd as she unpacked the basket, revealing sandwiches, a thermos of coffee, and sliced apples. "You know what your father used to say about friendship," Jonathan sighed, knowing she would tell him regardless of whether he wanted to hear it. He said, "True friendship doesn't keep a ledger. Doesn't matter if it's been a day or 25 years. She set a mug of steaming coffee beside him. "Now drink that and get to brushing. That horse has been waiting for you longer than you realize." After Nancy left, Jonathan sat with the brush in his hand, regarding it as though it were some alien artifact. Chestnut watched him with patient eyes, his condition seemingly improved enough that he had managed to lift his head, though he remained lying on his side. "I suppose it couldn't hurt," Jonathan finally said, moving closer to the horse. Tentatively, he began to brush Chestnut's neck, his strokes awkward and hesitant at first, but gradually muscle memory took over. The rhythm of the brush against the horse's coat became more confident, more natural. Jonathan found himself falling into the familiar pattern, long, smooth strokes that followed the direction of the hair, the way his father had taught him. "Start at the neck and work your way back," Robert had instructed a 9-year-old Jonathan. "Gentle but firm. A horse can feel a fly land on its skin, so you don't need to press hard." As he worked, Jonathan was surprised to find the tension gradually leaving his shoulders. There was something meditative about the repetitive motion, something grounding in the simple task of caring for another creature. Dust and loose hair collected on the brush, and Jonathan paused periodically to clean it, just as he'd been taught. Chestnut's coat, dull and rough when he began, slowly revealed hints of its former luster under his ministrations. "You're starting to look more like yourself," Jonathan murmured, surprising himself with the softness in his voice. Working his way methodically down Chestnut's body, Jonathan discovered several areas where the coat was matted or tangled. He worked through these with patient fingers, careful not to pull or cause discomfort. Martin clearly cared for the horse, but the old man had many responsibilities around the estate, and Jonathan realized he couldn't possibly provide the kind of attentive grooming that Chestnut had once been accustomed to. When he reached the horse's legs, Jonathan had to pause. Chestnut still couldn't stand, so Jonathan carefully lifted each leg to access all sides, his hands remembering how to support the weight, how to communicate his intentions through touch so the horse wouldn't be startled. "You know," he said, continuing the one-sided conversation that had somehow become natural over the past hours, "Dad always said you could judge a man's character by how he treated animals." He worked a small tangle free from Chestnut's mane. Said they could see right through pretense. "No fooling a horse or a dog about who you really are." Chestnut snorted softly, as if in agreement, and Jonathan found himself smiling, a genuine smile, not the practiced expression he wore in boardrooms and at charity galas. As he worked, more memories surfaced, less painful now in the quiet sanctuary of the stable. He recalled summer days spent riding through the countryside, the freedom he'd felt with the wind in his hair and Chestnut strong and sure beneath him. The simple joy of racing across open fields, no destination in mind, just the pleasure of movement and connection. When had life become so complicated? When had success become measured only in acquisitions and profit margins? By the time he finished grooming, nearly 2 hours had passed. Chestnut's coat gleamed with renewed health, and the horse seemed more alert, his eyes brighter. Most encouragingly, he had managed to sit up in a more natural resting position, though he still showed no interest in trying to stand. Jonathan set aside the brushes and reached for the apples Nancy had brought. Slicing one into small pieces, he offered a slice to Chestnut, holding it flat on his palm the way his father had taught him. The horse's lips tickled against his skin as Chestnut delicately accepted the offering. "That's it," Jonathan encouraged. "Small steps." The stable door opened, and Dr. Mitchell returned as promised, looking somewhat surprised to find Jonathan still there, his expensive robe now thoroughly stained with dirt, horsehair, and who knew what else. "Mr. Maxwell," she greeted him. "How's our patient this morning?" "Better, I think," Jonathan replied. "He's more alert, and he just ate a little apple." The veterinarian nodded approvingly as she began her examination. "That's a good sign. Has he had any water?" "Some, not much." Dr. Mitchell checked Chestnut's vital signs, her expression growing more optimistic as she worked. "His heart rate is more stable, and his gut sounds are improving." She straightened up. "I think we're out of immediate danger, but he's still very weak. It'll be a few days before we know if he's fully recovered." "But he will recover," Jonathan pressed. "I wouldn't have thought so last night," she admitted. "Colic in a horse his age, but he's showing remarkable resilience." She glanced at Jonathan curiously. "Martin mentioned you stayed with him all night." Jonathan nodded, suddenly self-conscious about his disheveled appearance and the unlikely scene he must present. The notorious hard-driving CEO of Maxwell Investments, covered in dirt and horsehair, keeping vigil over an ancient farm animal. "Well, it seems to have helped," Dr. Mitchell said, packing up her equipment. "Horses are sensitive creatures. Having someone they trust nearby can make all the difference." "He doesn't trust me," Jonathan said automatically. "He hardly knows me anymore." Dr. Mitchell gave him a measured look. "Mr. Maxwell, I've been a veterinarian for 20 years. That horse trusts you. Might be worth asking yourself why." After she left, Jonathan sat back down on the hay bale, contemplating her words. Chestnut had drifted off to sleep again, his breathing deeper and more regular now. Outside, Jonathan could hear the normal sounds of his estate coming to life. Gardeners tending to the immaculate landscaping, housekeeping staff going about their duties. His other life was waiting for him. Meetings, calls, decisions that affected thousands of people and millions of dollars. For the first time in years, Jonathan found himself reluctant to return to it. His phone had been buzzing incessantly since he'd moved to a spot in the stable with better reception. 17 missed calls, 39 emails, 28 text messages. The world apparently couldn't function without Jonathan Maxwell for 12 hours. Or could it? He scrolled through the messages and saw nothing that truly qualified as an emergency. Problems that had seemed critical yesterday now appeared trivial when viewed from the quiet perspective of the stable. On impulse, Jonathan composed a brief email to his executive team. "Taking a personal day, handle the London call, reschedule everything else. We'll check in tomorrow. JM." He hit send before he could reconsider, then set the phone aside. After sending the email, Jonathan felt a strange sense of liberation. When was the last time he had taken a personal day? He couldn't remember. Even on vacations, he spent most of his time on conference calls or reviewing reports. The concept of truly stepping away, even for a day, was foreign to him. His stomach growled, reminding him that he'd barely touched Nancy's sandwiches. As he reached for one, a thought occurred to him. He glanced toward the dumpster visible through the stable window. "Oh, I'll be right back," he told the sleeping Chestnut, rising stiffly from his seat on the hay bale. Outside, the mid-morning sun was bright, making Jonathan squint as he crossed to the dumpster. He peered inside, looking for the black garbage bag. It wasn't immediately visible, and for a moment he feared it had already been taken away. But then he spotted a corner of it, partially hidden beneath some landscaping waste. Grimacing at what he was about to do, Jonathan hoisted himself up and leaned into the dumpster, stretching to reach the bag. "Mr. Maxwell." Jonathan froze, then slowly turned his head to see Martin staring at him in undisguised astonishment. The image must have been absurd, the billionaire CEO in a filthy robe, half inside a dumpster. "I'm retrieving something," Jonathan said, dignity entirely abandoned. Martin's face remained carefully neutral. "Can I help you with that, sir?" Jonathan considered his position and relented. "Yes, thank you. The black bag from yesterday. It should be under those branches." Martin efficiently located and extracted the bag, handing it to Jonathan without comment, though his eyes betrayed his curiosity. "The riding equipment," Jonathan explained, feeling oddly like a child caught doing something forbidden. I thought it might. Chestnut seemed to recognize it." "He would," Martin nodded. "Your father used that tack with him for decades." They walked back to the stable together, Martin carrying the bag. "How long did you work for my father?" Jonathan asked, realizing he'd never bothered to inquire before. "I didn't work for him exactly," Martin replied. "We were friends, served in the army together, back in the day. When my wife passed 5 years ago, your father suggested I take the groundskeeper position here, said it would be good for me to stay busy." Jonathan absorbed this information with surprise. "I didn't know you were friends. He spoke of you often." Martin said, his voice carefully neutral. Kept every newspaper article about your business successes in a scrapbook. Jonathan stopped walking. He what? Martin met his gaze steadily. And he was proud of you, Mr. Maxwell. Even when he disagreed with your methods, he was proud of what you'd built. The simple statement hit Jonathan like a physical blow. His father had never expressed such pride to him directly. Their conversations had been filled with arguments about values and priorities, not recognition of accomplishments. He had a funny way of showing it, Jonathan finally said, resuming their walk to the stable. Robert wasn't one for saying things outright, Martin acknowledged. He believed actions spoke louder. When they reached the stable, Chestnut was awake, his ears pricking forward at their entrance. Jonathan approached him, the black bag now in his hands. "Look what I found," he said, opening the bag to reveal the riding equipment. He pulled out the old bridle first, its leather worn but still supple thanks to decades of careful maintenance. Chestnut's reaction was immediate. His nostrils flared as he caught the familiar scent, and he nickered softly, stretching his neck toward the bridle. "He knows it," Martin observed. Horses have incredible memories for scents and sounds associated with positive experiences. Jonathan ran his fingers over the intricate braiding on the bridle's browband, his mother's handiwork. She had been skilled at leathercraft, creating custom pieces that local riders had coveted. Next, he removed the saddle, heavier than he remembered, its leather scratched and worn in places but still fundamentally sound. Chestnut's ears followed his movements, the horse's interest unmistakable. "I should clean these," Jonathan said, surprising himself with the declaration. Martin smiled. "There's saddle soap in the tack room. I'll bring it out." While Martin fetched the supplies, Jonathan laid the equipment out on a clean patch of straw. In addition to the saddle and bridle, there were stirrup leathers, a girth, and several brushes of different sizes and functions. At the bottom of the bag, he found something unexpected, a small, leather-bound journal. He opened it carefully, immediately recognizing his father's neat, precise handwriting. It was a log of Chestnut's care, feeding schedules, exercise notes, medical records dating back almost 20 years. The most recent entry was just a week before Robert's death. Chestnut refused morning feed, the entry read. Ate when offered from hand, worried about his appetite declining, discussed with Dr. Mitchell. She says his blood work looks good for his age. Need to make arrangements for his care. Jay must understand his importance. Jay. Jonathan. The last sentence made his throat tighten uncomfortably. The final page of the journal contained an envelope addressed simply to Johnny. With slightly trembling fingers, Jonathan opened it and unfolded the letter inside. "Johnny," it began, the familiar nickname now striking him differently. "If you're reading this, I'm gone, and you've taken Chestnut as I asked. I know it's an imposition. I know horses aren't part of your world anymore. But he's the last link to a part of your life I've always hoped you'd remember someday. We've had our differences, son. I haven't always understood your choices, and I know you haven't understood mine. But please understand this. Chestnut isn't just a horse to me. He's the keeper of our family's best memories, your mother teaching you to ride. Those summer days when you disappear for hours and come back sunburned and happy. The way you looked sitting tall in the saddle, like you could take on the world. And you did take on the world, Johnny. Just not in the way I expected. I may not have said it enough, but I've always been proud of your determination. Even when I disagreed with you, I admired your conviction. Take care of Chestnut in his final years. And maybe, in caring for him, you'll remember that part of yourself that knew there was more to life than balance sheets and profit margins. With love, always, Dad. Jonathan lowered the letter, aware of a stinging in his eyes that he hadn't experienced in years. Martin had returned with the saddle soap and other cleaning supplies, but he stood at a respectful distance, giving Jonathan privacy with his father's words. A soft nicker drew Jonathan's attention. Chestnut was watching him, and with what seemed like tremendous effort, the horse was attempting to stand. "Whoa, easy," Jonathan said, quickly folding the letter and moving to Chestnut's side. The horse's legs trembled with effort as he struggled to rise from his recumbent position. "Don't rush him," Martin cautioned, setting down the cleaning supplies and joining Jonathan. "Let him do it at his own pace." Jonathan knelt beside Chestnut, placing a supportive hand on the horse's shoulder. "You can do it, old boy," he encouraged softly, one step at a time. With a tremendous effort, Chestnut managed to get his front legs underneath him, then paused, breathing heavily. Jonathan and Martin waited patiently, neither pushing nor pulling, simply offering their presence as support. After several moments, Chestnut gathered his strength and heaved himself upward, his back legs finding purchase in the straw. For a precarious moment, he wobbled unsteadily, and Jonathan held his breath, fearing the horse might collapse again. But then Chestnut found his balance, standing on all four legs, though still visibly weak. "Well done," Jonathan praised, a surprising surge of pride flooding through him. He stroked Chestnut's neck, feeling the strong pulse beneath his fingers. "Well done indeed." "This is excellent progress," Martin said, smiling broadly. "Dr. Mitchell will be pleased." Jonathan continued to stroke the horse, marveling at the simple victory they had just witnessed. In the high-stakes world of finance where he usually operated, success was measured in millions of dollars and market dominance. Here, success was a 30-year-old horse finding the strength to stand. Somehow, this modest achievement felt more meaningful than his last corporate acquisition. "I should give him some water," Jonathan said, remembering Dr. Mitchell's instructions. Martin nodded. "I'll get a fresh bucket. The old boy's probably thirsty after all that effort." As Martin stepped out, Jonathan found himself alone with Chestnut once more. The horse remained standing, his head lowered slightly, but his eyes alert and focused on Jonathan. "Dad's letter," Jonathan said quietly, pulling it from his pocket. "Did you know about this?" Chestnut blinked, as if considering the question seriously. "He said you're the keeper of our family's best memories." Jonathan's voice wavered slightly. "I didn't think he had any good memories of me. Not from the last 20 years. Anyway." The horse shifted his weight, moving slightly closer to Jonathan. "All this time, I thought he was disappointed in me, that nothing I did would ever be good enough." Jonathan glanced down at the letter again, his father's words jumping out at him. "I've always been proud of your determination." Why couldn't he just tell me that when he was alive? Martin returned with the water bucket, setting it down where Chestnut could easily reach it. The horse lowered his head and drank slowly but steadily. "That's a good sign," Martin observed. "Proper hydration is essential for recovery." Jonathan nodded absently, still preoccupied with the letter. Martin seemed to sense his distraction. "Your father wasn't one for expressing feelings directly," the groundskeeper said gently. "Some men of his generation are like that. Doesn't mean the feelings weren't there." Jonathan looked up sharply. "Did you know about this letter?" Martin shook his head. "No, but I'm not surprised. Robert was putting his affairs in order those last few months." "He knew his heart wasn't strong." "He never told me that either," Jonathan said, a fresh wave of grief washing over him. "I would have visited more often if I'd known he was ill." "Would you?" Martin's question wasn't accusatory, merely thoughtful. Jonathan wanted to say yes automatically, but honesty compelled him to reconsider. Would he have made time in his relentless schedule for more visits to the farmhouse? Would he have set aside the arguments and grievances to simply be a son to his ailing father? I don't know, he admitted finally. I'd like to think so. But we'd grown so far apart. Martin nodded understandingly. Robert used to say distance comes in many forms. The miles between your estate and his farm were the least of it. Jonathan thought about that as he watched Chestnut drink. Physical distance had been the easiest to measure, but perhaps the least significant of the separations between him and his father. I need to clean up, Jonathan said suddenly, aware of his disheveled state, and change clothes, but I'll be back to take care of the tack. I can clean it for you, Martin offered. No, Jonathan said firmly, and I want to do it myself. An hour later, showered and dressed in the most casual clothes he owned, which still consisted of designer jeans and a cashmere sweater, Jonathan returned to the stable. He found Chestnut now standing in a different position, having moved several steps from where they'd left him. Look at you, Jonathan said approvingly. I'm making progress already. He set down the tray he was carrying, a pot of coffee and a proper breakfast that his chef had insisted on preparing once he heard Jonathan was skipping his morning meetings. Then he turned his attention to the riding equipment still laid out on the straw. Taking a seat on a small stool, Jonathan picked up the saddle soap and a soft cloth. He began with the bridle, working the soap into the leather with careful, circular motions, the way his father had taught him. As he worked, his phone rang. He glanced at it. Thomas Chen again, his CFO, probably panicking about the London call. Jonathan hesitated, then silenced the ringer and returned to his task. The repetitive motion of cleaning the leather was soothing, much like grooming had been. Jonathan found his thoughts drifting to his father's words in the letter, the keeper of our family's best memories. He hadn't allowed himself to revisit those memories in years, finding it easier to focus on the disagreements and disappointments of his adult relationship with his father. But now, sitting in the quiet stable with Chestnut occasionally nickering softly beside him, Jonathan permitted himself to remember the good times, his father's patient instruction as he learned to ride, the pride in Robert's eyes when 10-year-old Jonathan won his first ribbon at the county fair, the family picnics by the creek that ran through their property. These memories had been buried beneath layers of ambition and resentment, but they hadn't disappeared. They'd been preserved, waiting for him to be ready to reclaim them. By the time Jonathan finished cleaning the bridle and moved on to the saddle, his phone had rung 3 more times. Each time, he let it go to voicemail. The world of Maxwell Investments seemed increasingly distant, as though it belonged to someone else entirely. Nancy Winters appeared at the stable door, this time carrying a wicker basket of apples and carrots. Thought our patient might enjoy some treats, she said, smiling at the sight of Chestnut standing. Well, look at that. Someone's feeling better. He got up about an hour ago, Jonathan told her, setting aside the saddle. Doctor Mitchell says he's making good progress. Nancy's eyes took in the scene, the half-cleaned tack, the breakfast tray, Jonathan's focused attention on his task. So are you, she observed quietly. Jonathan glanced up, startled by her comment. I'm just cleaning some old equipment. Nancy's smile was knowing, if that's what you need to tell yourself. She approached Chestnut, offering him a slice of apple. Your father would be pleased to see this, you know. The letter, Jonathan said, the question forming before he could consider it. Did you know about it? I helped him write it, Nancy admitted. His hands were getting too shaky toward the end. He dictated, I wrote it down. Jonathan absorbed this information. Why didn't either of you tell me he was so ill? Nancy fed Chestnut another apple slice before answering. He didn't want your pity, Jonathan, and he was afraid. Afraid? My father wasn't afraid of anything. He was afraid you'd come out of obligation, not love. Nancy's directness was startling. that your visits would be about managing his decline rather than healing what was broken between you. The words struck Jonathan with unexpected force. Had that been what kept his father from reaching out? Not pride or stubbornness, but fear that his son's response would be clinical rather than compassionate. I wouldn't have... Jonathan began, then stopped himself. Would his reaction have been so different from what his father feared? A year ago, a month ago, even a week ago, would he have approached his father's illness as a problem to be managed efficiently rather than a painful reality to be faced together? He couldn't honestly say. Nancy left shortly after delivering her gentle but pointed truth, leaving Jonathan to continue cleaning the tack and pondering her words. By mid-afternoon, both the saddle and bridle gleamed with renewed life, the leather supple and fragrant with the distinct smell that had permeated his childhood. Jonathan stood, stretching muscles unaccustomed to such manual labor. Chestnut had been alternating between standing and resting, each period on his feet growing longer. Now the horse watched as Jonathan gathered the cleaned equipment. "Where should I put these?" he asked aloud, looking around the simple stable. The answer came to him immediately: the tack room. When Jonathan entered the small adjoining space, he was struck by how sparse it was. A metal rack held a few modern bridles and halters, presumably purchased by Martin for basic care, but none had the character or quality of his father's equipment. Jonathan carefully arranged the newly cleaned tack on the rack, positioning the saddle on its proper stand. The pieces looked right there, as if returning to their natural habitat after a long exile. Back in the main stable, Chestnut had managed to walk to the half door of his stall, his head now extending outside, nostrils testing the afternoon air. It was a small victory, but Jonathan felt disproportionately pleased by this evidence of the horse's improving condition. "Feeling adventurous, are we?" he asked, approaching to stroke the horse's forehead. Chestnut leaned into his touch, eyes half closing in apparent contentment. The gesture was so trusting, so unguarded, that Jonathan felt something shift inside him, a wall crumbling, a defense mechanism failing. "I've missed this," he admitted quietly. "Missed you." His phone vibrated again in his pocket, the fifth call from his executive assistant in the past hour. With a sigh, Jonathan finally answered. "This better be important, Diane." "Mr. Maxwell." Her voice was tightly controlled, but couldn't quite hide her panic. "The Chen Group is threatening to pull out of the merger unless you personally attend the meeting tomorrow. Mr. Chen says your absence today sent a concerning message about your commitment to the partnership." The Chen Group merger was the cornerstone of Maxwell Investments' expansion strategy for the next fiscal year, a $2.3 billion deal that Jonathan had been orchestrating for months. "Tell Thomas to handle it," Jonathan replied, surprising himself with his own calmness. "Sir?" Diane's voice rose an octave. "Thomas specifically said he cannot proceed without your direct involvement. Mr. Chen is insisting on your presence. They've moved the meeting up to 9 a.m. tomorrow as a demonstration of urgency. 6 months of work, hundreds of hours of negotiations, millions in potential profits, all potentially evaporating because Jonathan had chosen to spend a day with a horse instead of in the boardroom. The old Jonathan, the Jonathan of just 2 days ago, would have immediately dropped everything, rushed back to his office, and worked through the night to salvage the deal. But now, watching Chestnut's calm breathing, feeling the warm afternoon sun streaming through the stable windows, Jonathan found himself weighing values on a different scale. "Diane," he said finally, "tell Thomas to inform Mr. Chen that I have a family emergency. I'll be at the meeting tomorrow, but not before 11 a.m. If that's not acceptable, then perhaps we need to reconsider whether this partnership is in our best interests after all." The silence on the other end of the line was profound. I'll convey that message, sir," Diane finally managed, her voice betraying her shock at this unprecedented response from her always accommodating boss. After ending the call, Jonathan leaned against the stable wall, slightly dazed by his own decision. Had he just risked a multi-billion-dollar deal for the sake of, what, exactly? A few more hours with an aging horse? No, he realized. Not just for Chestnut, but for something far more valuable. The space to reconnect with parts of himself he'd buried long ago, parts that his father had seen and valued even when Jonathan himself had dismissed them as irrelevant. Dr. Mitchell arrived for her afternoon checkup, pleased to find Chestnut standing and alert. "This is remarkable progress," she said, conducting her examination. "His vital signs are stabilizing, and his gut sounds are much improved." She glanced at Jonathan. "Whatever you're doing, it's working." "I'm not doing anything special," Jonathan protested mildly. Dr. Mitchell's smile was knowing. "Sometimes just being present is the most powerful medicine." She packed up her equipment. "Continue what you're doing. I think our patient will make a full recovery, though at his age, we'll need to be vigilant about monitoring for any recurrence." After she left, Jonathan found himself contemplating her words. Sometimes just being present is the most powerful medicine. How many important moments had he missed because he was physically present but mentally absent, already planning his next move, his next acquisition, his next triumph? His father's funeral came to mind. Jonathan had attended, of course, had even delivered a brief, dignified eulogy. But he'd spent most of the service checking emails on his phone, left immediately after the burial to attend an urgent conference call, and delegated all the actual arrangements to his assistant. He hadn't truly been present for his own father's funeral. The realization hit him with unexpected force, bringing a wave of shame that made him physically flinch. What kind of son had he become? A gentle nudge against his shoulder pulled Jonathan from his spiral of self-recrimination. Chestnut had moved closer, his soft muzzle now pressing against Jonathan in what seemed remarkably like comfort. "Thank you," Jonathan said softly, stroking the horse's neck. "But I don't deserve your kindness. I abandoned you too, didn't I? Left you to Dad, then to Martin, never once looking back." Chestnut simply continued to stand beside him, offering the uncomplicated companionship that animals provide. Presence without judgment, comfort without conditions. Martin appeared at the stable door, carrying a tray with sandwiches and a thermos. "Thought you might be hungry," he said. "You've been out here all day." Jonathan accepted the food gratefully, suddenly aware of his hunger. "Thank you, Martin, for this, and for taking such good care of Chestnut all these months." The groundskeeper nodded. "It's been my pleasure. He's a fine animal." "The best," Jonathan agreed, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. As they shared the simple meal, Jonathan found himself asking Martin questions about his father's final months, questions he should have asked long ago. He learned that Robert had remained active almost to the end, tending his small vegetable garden, helping neighbors with repairs, playing checkers with the local children who still visited the old farm despite its diminished state. "He never lost his love for this land," Martin said. "Even after selling most of it, said the soil was in his blood. He wanted me to love it too," Jonathan mused. "The farm, the work, the lifestyle. I think that's why we clashed so often. I saw it as him trying to limit my ambitions, but maybe he was just trying to pass on what he valued most." Martin considered this. "Your father was a complex man, Mr. Maxwell. He was proud of your success. Make no mistake. But I think he worried you'd sacrifice too much to achieve it." "He might have been right," Jonathan admitted, the words feeling like a surrender and a liberation simultaneously. Chestnut had moved to the stable door, looking out at the paddock beyond. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grass, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the old oak tree that stood sentinel at the edge of the property. "Do you think he's strong enough for a short walk outside?" Jonathan asked. Martin assessed the horse thoughtfully. "A few minutes in the fresh air might do him good, as long as we don't overtax him." Together, they helped Chestnut navigate the short distance from the stable to the paddock. The horse moved slowly but with increasing confidence, his strength visibly returning with each passing hour. In the paddock, Chestnut lifted his head, nostrils flaring as he took in the familiar scents of grass and earth and open sky. For a moment, Jonathan could almost see the powerful young horse of his childhood memories superimposed over this elderly, recovering animal, the spirit unchanged despite the physical transformation of the years. "There's life in him yet," Martin observed. "Yes," Jonathan agreed quietly. "Then there is." And perhaps, he thought, but didn't say aloud, there was still life in parts of himself he'd thought long dead as well. The evening settled over the estate, painting the sky in deepening shades of orange and purple. Jonathan and Martin had helped Chestnut back to his stall, where the horse was now contentedly munching on fresh hay. After ensuring Chestnut was comfortable, Martin had headed home, leaving Jonathan alone with his thoughts and the gentle sounds of the horse's movement. Jonathan sat on the hay bale that had become his accustomed spot, his father's journal open in his hands. He'd been reading through the entries, tracing the history of Chestnut's life through his father's meticulous notes. It was like viewing his own past through a different lens, the competitions he'd forgotten, trail rides mentioned with pride, the gradual transition from Jonathan riding Chestnut to his father taking over as Jonathan's visits became less frequent and eventually ceased altogether. Between the factual entries about Chestnut's care were occasional personal observations that hit Jonathan with unexpected force. "Johnny called today, too busy to visit. Chestnut seemed to listen for his voice when I was on the phone." And later, showed Chestnut the newspaper article about Johnny's new office building. "Silly to think he understands, but he's the only one I can share my pride with who won't misinterpret it." The entries chronicled not just Chestnut's life, but the slow dissolution of Jonathan's relationship with his father, a dissolution that, reading between the lines, Robert had mourned deeply even while respecting his son's chosen path. As darkness fell, Jonathan switched on the small lamp that hung from a beam, casting a warm glow over the stable. His phone had been mercifully quiet for the past hour, though he knew the reprieve was temporary. Tomorrow would bring the Chen meeting and all the expectations and demands of his position at Maxwell Investments. But tonight belonged to this quiet space, to Chestnut, and to the memories he was finally allowing himself to reclaim. On impulse, Jonathan retrieved his father's saddle from the tack room and brought it to Chestnut's stall. The horse's ears pricked forward immediately, recognizing the familiar item. "Just thought you might like to see it," Jonathan explained, holding the saddle where Chestnut could catch its scent. "Probably brings back memories for you too, doesn't it?" Chestnut nickered softly, stretching his neck to nuzzle the saddle. The simple action held such obvious affection that Jonathan felt his throat tighten. "Dame, I've been thinking," he said, continuing the one-sided conversation that had become natural over the past day and a half. "About Dad, about what he was trying to tell me all those years." He set the saddle on its stand, which he'd brought into the stall. "I thought he wanted me to be exactly like him, to choose the farm over everything else. But that wasn't it at all, was it?" Chestnut's intelligent eyes seemed to encourage him to continue. Only he didn't care if I was a farmer or a financier. He just wanted me to remember that success isn't measured by the size of your bank account. Jonathan ran his hand along the horse's neck. He wanted me to build something meaningful, not just profitable, and somewhere along the way, I forgot the difference. The realization had been forming gradually over the past 36 hours, but articulating it aloud made it suddenly crystallinely clear. His father hadn't opposed his ambition, he'd opposed the cost of that ambition, the relationships sacrificed, the values compromised, the joy forgotten in the relentless pursuit of more. Jonathan's phone vibrated in his pocket. He checked it to find a text from Thomas Chen. Moved meeting to 11 a.m. as requested. Mr. Chen unhappy but acquiescing. Need your input on revised proposal ASAP. Attached was a document outlining changes to the merger agreement, changes that would accelerate the consolidation of the two companies and, incidentally, eliminate nearly 200 jobs that Jonathan had originally planned to preserve through a more gradual transition. 6 months ago, Jonathan would have viewed these changes as an acceptable sacrifice for the sake of efficiency and profit margins. 2 days ago, he might have hesitated but ultimately agreed. Now, looking at Chestnut, the embodiment of values that couldn't be quantified on a balance sheet, Jonathan made a decision that would have been unthinkable to his former self. He typed a quick response. Proposal unacceptable. Original terms stand, including job preservation clauses and community investment provisions. Non-negotiable. After sending the message, Jonathan set his phone aside, feeling a curious mixture of anxiety and relief. He might have just torpedoed the biggest deal of his career, and yet he felt more certain of this decision than he had of any business move in recent memory. Dad would have liked that, he told Chestnut with a small smile. Not that he'd have admitted it. A soft sound at the stable door made Jonathan look up. Nancy Winters stood there, a thermos in one hand and a small package in the other. Thought you might need some coffee, she said, entering and handing him the thermos. And something else I think you should have. Jonathan accepted both items, curious about the package wrapped in simple brown paper. What's this? Open it, Nancy encouraged, settling herself on another hay bale. Unwrapping the package, Jonathan found a framed photograph he'd never seen before. It showed his father standing beside Chestnut. But what caught Jonathan's breath was the newspaper clipping Robert was holding up for the camera. A front-page story about Maxwell Investments' successful public offering 5 years earlier, with Jonathan's picture prominently featured. The pride in his father's face was unmistakable. "Oh, when was this taken?" Jonathan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "The day your company went public," Nancy replied. "He had me take it so he could send it to you, but then he lost his nerve, said you'd probably think it was silly, him posing with a horse and your picture like that." Jonathan stared at the photograph, unable to speak for several moments. All those years he'd believed his father had dismissed his achievements, had seen only the ruthless businessman his son had become, not the success he'd achieved. But here was evidence of a very different reality. A father bursting with pride, but too uncertain of his reception to share it. "He kept every article," Nancy continued softly. "Every time your name appeared in the business section. He'd read them aloud to anyone who'd listen. Me, Martin, even old Pastor Davis, who could barely hear a word. 'That's my Johnny,' he'd say. Always knew he'd make something of himself. But he never said any of this to me," Jonathan said, still trying to reconcile this new information with decades of perceived disapproval. "Pride's a complicated thing," Nancy observed. "Sometimes it gets all tangled up with worry and disappointment, and plain old stubbornness doesn't make it any less real." Jonathan carefully set the frame on the shelf beside Chestnut's stall, positioning it so he could see both his father's face and his own much younger one looking back at him. Two Maxwell men, separated by generations and values and choices, but connected by something deeper than any of those differences. "I've been thinking about the future," Jonathan said after a while, "about Maxwell Investments, about what happens next." Nancy nodded encouragingly but didn't interrupt. "I built the company to prove something, to Dad, to myself, to everyone who said I was reaching too high. But somewhere along the way, it became about the numbers, not the purpose." He glanced at Chestnut, who was listening with pricked ears as if understanding every word. "I think it's time to remember why I started in the first place." "And why was that?" Nancy asked gently. Jonathan smiled, memories surfacing that he hadn't visited in years. "To create something lasting, something that would make a difference." He laughed softly. "Ironic, isn't it? Dad and I wanted the same thing all along. We just saw different paths to get there." Nancy's eyes were kind as she rose to leave. "It's never too late to find a better path, Jonathan. Robert knew that. It's why he held on to hope for you and for Chestnut right to the end." After she left, Jonathan remained with Chestnut, sharing the comfortable silence that had grown between them. Tomorrow would bring challenges: the Chen meeting, the repercussions of his uncharacteristic absence, the decisions that waited to be made about the future direction of his company. But tonight, in this stable that had become an unexpected sanctuary, Jonathan felt a peace he hadn't experienced in decades. As if sensing his thoughts, Chestnut leaned his head against Jonathan's shoulder in a gesture of simple affection. "Thank you," Jonathan whispered, wrapping his arm around the horse's neck, "for helping me find my way back." To what, exactly, he wasn't yet sure. Not to the past. That was impossible. But perhaps to a future that honored what was best about his father's values, while incorporating the strengths he had developed in building his own path. A future where balance sheets and bottom lines still mattered, but never at the expense of the things that truly gave life its value. 3 months later, the early morning sun painted golden streaks across the expanded paddock behind Jonathan's mansion. The old stable had been renovated and enlarged, now housing not only Chestnut, but 3 rescue horses that Jonathan had adopted from a local sanctuary facing financial difficulties. Jonathan stood at the fence, dressed not in his usual business attire, but in well-worn jeans and a flannel shirt that would have made his father smile with recognition. His Italian leather shoes had been replaced by practical boots, and his perfectly styled hair was slightly tousled by the morning breeze. "Good morning, old friend," he called as Chestnut trotted toward him with surprising vigor for a horse his age. The senior equine had made a remarkable recovery from his bout with colic. "Doctor." Mitchell attributed it to excellent care and the horse's strong will to live, but Jonathan suspected there was another factor at play, a renewed sense of purpose that both he and Chestnut had discovered together. "Board meeting at 10, Jonathan told the horse, offering an apple from his pocket. "They're not going to like what I have to say, but I think Dad would approve." The Chen merger had ultimately fallen through. Jonathan's insistence on maintaining the original terms, particularly those protecting jobs and community investments, had proven unacceptable to the other company. The stock had taken a temporary hit, and the business press had been filled with speculation about whether Jonathan Maxwell was losing his edge. But in the weeks that followed, something unexpected had happened. Maxwell Investments' commitment to ethical business practices had attracted a different kind of partner, companies and investors who valued sustainable growth over explosive profits, community impact alongside shareholder returns. "Mr. Maxwell," Martin called, approaching from the direction of the main house. In the months since Chestnut's illness, The groundskeeper had become something more than an employee, a friend, a connection to his father, a gentle voice of wisdom when Jonathan found himself torn between old habits and new values. The contractor called about the farmhouse renovation. Martin said, "They've finished the foundation work and want to know if you'd like to come by to see it before they begin framing." Jonathan nodded. "I'll go this afternoon after the board meeting." The farmhouse renovation was actually a complete rebuilding of his father's old home, which the developer had been preparing to demolish before Jonathan bought back the property at considerably more than market value, in a move that had mystified his financial advisors. "And Nancy called," Martin continued. "The first group of kids will be starting the program next week. She wanted to know if you'd be there for the opening." "Wouldn't miss it," Jonathan replied with a smile. The program was the Robert Maxwell Memorial Youth Riding Program, established on the reclaimed farmland with funding from a new charitable foundation Jonathan had created. It would provide equine therapy and riding lessons to underprivileged children and those with disabilities, a cause his father had supported in small ways throughout his life, now expanded to serve hundreds of children annually. Martin hesitated, then added, "There's one more thing. The board called. Mr. Peterson wants to confirm that you're still planning to present the reorganization proposal today." Jonathan's smile faded slightly. "Yes. It's time." The reorganization he planned to present would fundamentally reshape Maxwell Investments, decentralizing decision-making, establishing stronger ethical guidelines for investments, and most controversially, reducing their profit targets to allow for more sustainable business practices and employee benefits. Some board members would resist, a few might resign. The business press would have a field day speculating about whether Jonathan Maxwell had lost his killer instinct. But for the first time in his career, Jonathan was approaching a business decision with complete clarity and conviction. This wasn't about maximizing short-term profits or outmaneuvering competitors. It was about building something that would outlast him, something with purpose beyond the bottom line. "I think Dad was trying to tell me something all those years," Jonathan mused, more to himself than to Martin, about the difference between making a living and making a life. Martin nodded. Robert was wise that way. Not always good at expressing it, but wise nonetheless. "I spent 20 years thinking he didn't understand me," Jonathan said, watching as Chestnut wandered off to graze alongside a younger rescue horse, a former racehorse named Daybreak who had been destined for slaughter before finding sanctuary with Jonathan. Turns out I was the one who didn't understand." After Martin left to attend to his duties, Jonathan remained at the fence a little longer, reluctant to leave this peaceful scene for the boardroom battles that awaited him. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Diane, probably calling with last-minute updates before the meeting. "I'll be there in 30 minutes, he answered without checking the screen. "And actually, I'm calling about something else," his assistant replied, her voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "The charity committee wanted me to confirm that you're still planning to host the fundraiser here next month. They need to finalize the invitations." The fundraiser, another new initiative, this one using Jonathan's social connections to raise money for rural healthcare services in communities like the one where his father had lived. "Yes, absolutely. And Diane, make sure the invitation mentions that we'll be offering horse-drawn carriage rides. Chestnut will be leading the procession." After ending the call, Jonathan checked his watch. He needed to change for the board meeting, back into the suit and tie that still represented an important part of who he was. He hadn't abandoned his business acumen or his drive for excellence. He'd simply expanded his definition of success to include metrics his father would have recognized. As he turned toward the house, he spotted something leaning against the stable wall, his father's saddle, cleaned and oiled, ready for use. On impulse, Jonathan changed direction and retrieved it, running his hands over the supple leather. "Doctor." Mitchell had cleared Chestnut for light riding a few weeks earlier, but Jonathan had been hesitant, unsure if either of them was ready for that step. Now, watching the old horse moving with renewed energy across the paddock, he made a decision. "What do you say, Chestnut?" he called. "After the board meeting, just a short ride, for old time's sake." The horse lifted his head as if understanding, ears pricked forward attentively. Later that afternoon, after the contentious but ultimately successful board meeting where Jonathan's vision for the company's future had prevailed despite significant opposition, he returned to the stable. The suit had been exchanged once more for jeans and boots, and his expression held the satisfied look of a man who had fought for something meaningful and won. Martin had helped prepare Chestnut, and the horse stood patiently as Jonathan carefully secured his father's saddle. "You sure about this?" Martin asked. "It's been a long time." "For both of us," Jonathan acknowledged, checking the girth one final time. "But some things you don't forget." With surprising grace for a man who hadn't been on horseback in 25 years, Jonathan mounted. Chestnut stood perfectly still until his rider was settled, then turned his head as if checking that everything was as it should be. "Just around the paddock," Jonathan said, gathering the reins with hands that remembered their purpose despite the decades between rides. "Nice and easy." As they began to move, Jonathan felt a rush of memories, not just of riding itself, but of who he had been before ambition and resentment had narrowed his vision. The boy who had loved this horse, who had treasured summer days spent exploring the countryside, who had known without being told that some experiences couldn't be measured in dollars and cents. Nancy Winters stood at the fence, watching with a knowing smile as horse and rider made their slow circuit of the paddock. Beside her was a small framed photograph, the one of Robert with the newspaper clipping, which she had brought to show Jonathan a recent discovery. "Look at the date," she would tell him later, pointing to the barely visible timestamp in the corner of the image. It had been taken just 2 weeks before Robert's death, when his heart was already failing. One of his final acts had been to document his pride in his son's achievements, even knowing he might never find the courage to share it directly. But that conversation was still to come. For now, Jonathan focused on the simple joy of reconnection. With Chestnut, with the parts of himself he had nearly lost, with a legacy more meaningful than the one he had spent decades pursuing. As they completed their circuit, Jonathan guided Chestnut toward the fence where Nancy waited. The horse stopped without being asked, seeming to recognize their old neighbor. "He looks happy," Nancy observed, reaching out to stroke Chestnut's nose. "You both do." "We're getting there," Jonathan replied, with a smile that reached his eyes, a genuine expression that had been increasingly frequent in recent months. From the pocket of his jeans, he pulled out his father's letter, now worn at the creases from frequent reading. He no longer needed to open it to recall the words that had become a compass for his recalibrated life. "Take care of Chestnut in his final years. And maybe, in caring for him, you'll remember that part of yourself that knew there was more to life than balance sheets and profit margins." "And you knew, didn't you?" Jonathan said to Chestnut, leaning forward to pat the horse's neck. "That day by the dumpster, you knew what was in that black bag was too valuable to throw away." Chestnut nickered softly, as if in agreement. In the distance, the rebuilt farmhouse was taking shape, not an exact replica of his father's home, but a place that honored its spirit while looking toward the future. Soon it would be filled with the sounds of children learning to ride, discovering the same joy and confidence that a young Jonathan had found on the back of a chestnut horse many years ago. Some legacies couldn't be measured in dollars, Some inheritances weren't listed in wills or transferred through legal documents. As the afternoon sun bathed the expanded paddocks in golden light, Jonathan Maxwell, businessman, son, and once again rider, understood at last what his father had been trying to tell him all along. Success wasn't about what you accumulated. It was about what you built that outlasted you, the lives you touched, the values you upheld, the love you gave without expectation of return. Sitting tall in his father's saddle, Jonathan felt a peace that no business triumph had ever provided. Chestnut, sensing his rider's contentment, arched his neck proudly, the years seeming to fall away from them both. The black bag that had nearly carried away these connections now served a new purpose, holding grooming supplies for the rescue horses, a tangible reminder of how close Jonathan had come to discarding what he now recognized as his most valuable inheritance. Not his father's riding equipment, but the wisdom it represented, the values it embodied, the connection it restored. "Come on, old friend," Jonathan said, gathering the reins once more. "Man, we've got a lot of ground to cover." And together, they moved forward into the lengthening afternoon, two old souls finding new purpose in each other's company, leaving behind the shadow of what might have been lost and stepping into the light of what had been reclaimed.